They found him just after midnight, sprawled on the turkey-red carpet of his library like a toppled statue, eyes glazed in a final, astonished stare. The lamp was still burning on the desk, its glass chimney streaked with a fingerprint of soot and blood. Ledgers lay open as if the numbers themselves had tried to crawl away. The physician who stooped beside the body, trembling, careful, already sensing the reach of this night, would later write that he had never seen a human skull fail so completely. The fractures radiated like a smashed bottle, and tiny fragments, bone pale against brown mahogany, were embedded 6 feet away. As though violence had blown outward in a breath no one heard. Within an hour, the room was sealed and the whispers had begun. A butler swore he'd heard a single shot. A maid said she saw a shadow, as tall as the doorframe, slip past the kitchen. Too quiet for a person, too solid for a ghost. By dawn, the marsh was alive with lanterns and dogs, men sloshing into black water, calling a name they feared to make whole. The magistrate arrived before the sun shook itself free of fog. He took statements. He marked distances. He tried not to look at the thing that used to be a planter's head. On the inventory page of his notebook, he wrote, 1 pistol, discharged once. 1 desk, blotter spattered. 1 sash window unlatched, sill smeared with blood. 1 overseer pale with terror. 1 name spoken by more than 1 mouth, Sarah. If you listened in the hours after, you could hear Charleston itself adjusting to the news chairs scraping in coffee houses. Clink of glass paused mid-air. Carriage wheels hesitating as they rounded corners near Broad and Meeting. Word moved as fast as fear, the owner of Marsh Bend. Josiah Crane, dead in his library. His killer, a woman of impossible height and strength. Her escape, a vanishing act into the cypress dark. People said, God help us, and I knew it would come to this and find her. Each sentence, a small stone dropped into water, already full of stones. But this story does not begin with blood. It begins with ledgers, and with a city that learned to keep its voice steady while it priced a life. Charleston in the spring of 1823 was a brilliant mirage erected on exhausted backs. Ships shouldered in from the Caribbean, from New Orleans, from Norfolk, their decks ripe with molasses and indigo and stories that no one respectable repeated aloud. Warehouse bells rang, tallymen shouted, and a sour-sweet ribbon of marsh air threaded through everything. If you walked down Chalmers Street on a market day, oyster shells crunched underfoot and the auction house doors yawned like mouths that never closed. The auctions were a ritualized weather, predictable, profitable, and always a little murderous. Men weighed bales and barrels with the same practiced eyes they used for bodies, pen nibs scratched like insects in the creases of account books. Advertisements bragged of fine field hands, prime wenches, boys suitable for house service. The grammar of ownership polished until it gleamed. Inside, a crowd gathered, planters in linen cravats, merchants who swore they never bought, curious boys who watched and understood too quickly. There was laughter that pretended not to be nervous. There was silence that admitted nothing. That Tuesday dawned with heat that belonged to July, not March. It pasted shirts to backs and made tempers short. The auctioneer, Mr. Vanderhorst, a man with cheeks like split peaches and an orotund voice he trusted, began with the ordinary, a cooper with good shoulders, a seamstress whose hands moved faster than talk. Then the murmur began, a collective inhalation that has its own grammar too. Heads turned toward the side door. Even before she ducked through it, the rumor had entered first. She stepped onto the platform in ankle irons and wrist manacles that looked comically small, as if made for a child's game. She was tall enough that the transom light laid itself across her hair, and broad enough that a man beside her seemed an afterthought sketched in the margin. The clerk wrote Sarah and nothing else, because the practice of the place required no surnames for the sold. A scrap of paper pinned to her dress said Virginia, and if it concealed a childhood, as a mother's hands. A night spent listening to rain on a roof that would not be hers. None of that troubled the pen. In the crowd, someone gasped and then laughed to deny the gasp. A physician pulled a measuring ribbon from his pocket and measured without touching. Another man, more candid, said what others thought God above. Vanderhorst made a joke about rare proportions, but his eyes had that glitter money puts there. The bidding started high and climbed as if the room itself leaned upward. 400, 800, 1,000. Planters who had arrived to buy 3 boys for the rice gates found themselves bidding in a fever, trading in ore as much as labor. There are details the ledger will not give you. The way she kept her gaze level, not on faces, but on a horizon found somewhere behind a wall. The small tremor in the floorboards when she shifted her weight. How the boy tasked with wiping the platform dry after each lot forgot his rag in his hand. Stillness has as many kinds as words have uses. And hers was not meekness. It was storage. When the voice from the back said 1,300, it bored through the room's noise like an auger. Men twisted to see who had thrown the rope over the price and hauled. It was Crane 42. A widower, ash-blonde hair already thinning, his self-regard trimmed as close as his hedges. He had a reputation for efficiency the way a hurricane has a reputation for wind. The men around him made space the way dogs do for a creature that is not a dog and not afraid. Sold. Vanderhorst sang. The syllable bright as coin. The clerk wrote the figure with a satisfied stroke, and a runner brought the bill to Crane with the exaggerated care men use for expensive things. The manacles clinked when she was led down from the platform. The crowd rediscovered their chins. Someone said, in a tone meant only for himself, "Lord, she could take a gate off its hinge." Someone else said, "Too loud. I'd like to see what she can lift." Vanderhorst laughed because that was part of the service. Work on the rice coast is a conversation with water that ends in fever. Crane's plantation marsh bend sat in a green geometry of paddies and dikes, all of it tricked by gates to welcome the tide and then dismiss it. The great house wore columns like epaulets and looked out over fields that pretended to be lakes when the moon pulled. Behind it, the cabins kept themselves small and close, wood gone soft at the edges, floors that remembered every step as dust. The mill creaked and shook itself like an old horse. Mosquitoes stitched the air so densely that evening light seemed netted. When Sarah arrived, the overseer stared as if confronted with a judgment he did not know how to refuse. In a letter to his brother, he would not intend it to survive him. But such things are stubborn, he wrote, that a creature of unnatural dimension had come under his charge, and that standing upright, she makes a man feel as a boy who has just lied. Crane read the letter and smiled, because fear in other men felt to him like a well-made glove. He did not buy her for the rose alone. Within a week, the front veranda became a stage. Neighbors arrived under the friendly pretext of bourbon and the unfriendly pleasure of spectacle. Crane would speak her name the way one says the name of a famous horse. He would have barrels rolled out and invite her to lift them. An anvil was tried one afternoon. To great delight. Hands soft. Ringed nested inside her hands and came away whispering. At night, when the lamps were carried back to the sideboard and the gentleman had gone, the parlor would smell faintly of iron and sweat and something like shame left unclaimed. You will be told, by men who prefer their stories tidy, that what happened later began in that library with rage, or in a swamp with flight. The truth is duller and more fatal. It began with money. Crane's ledgers grew meaner year by year, rice prices fickle. A shipping venture that collapsed like wet plaster. Creditors who stopped using his Christian name. The arithmetic of cruelty sharpened. New workers were bought when old ones' bodies had the audacity to fail. Strong backs were made to stand in water until the lungs took on the swamp the way a sponge does. The graveyards along the live oaks filled as quietly as tide in a ditch. By then, the city's gossip had given the woman a surname, Drummond, from some forgery of memory or line item half read. Whether the name belonged to her or to a man who once bought her mother and kept receipts, no one would pause to wonder. Names, in such a world, were less biography than leash. On a desk in the great house, beside the lamp that would one night burn too late, lay a stack of notices from creditors and an inventory Crane had revised 3 times in as many weeks. He tapped the page with a finger and did what the men of his class were trained from boyhood to do. He made a column add up by subtracting a person. Outside, beyond the veranda rail, a wind came slow over the rice, and laid the green in one direction, like the nap of velvet. In the quarters, someone hummed a tune from a place that had no map, and in a cabin that smelled of soap and heat, a woman whose hands could cradle a man's skull and whose silence could load a room lifted her head, as if something at the edge of the night had called it by name. The legend says she was born somewhere between the red clay and the pine woods of Piedmont, North Carolina. The records, what little there are, tell almost nothing. No date, no surname, no mother's name that survived an auctioneer's tongue, only female child. Exceptional size, but the soil remembers in its own way. And in that soil, the girl who would become Sarah Drummond learned to move quietly in a world that was already measuring her for chains. Be 19. She stood close to 7 feet tall, shoulders broad, hands heavy enough to cup a man's jaw as though it were glass. To those who saw her, she was something beyond understanding. To the trader who found her, she was a windfall. The diagnosis that modern medicine calls pituitary gigantism was, in that century, branded with simpler words: curse, freak, the devil's touch. Men found reason to fear what they did not name, and profit in what they feared. In March of 1823, a slave trader named Caleb Rutherford brought his coffle of 37 chained souls down from Virginia and North Carolina toward Charleston. They walked 50 miles of dust and sweat, their feet splitting open against gravel roads and heat, stopping only when the oxen were too tired to pull the wagons. When the city's church spires first appeared through the fog, Rutherford smiled. The markets were hungry that season. The wars in the Caribbean had disrupted supply, and rice planters needed new hands for the killing fields of the Low Country. The Chalmers Street auction house smelled of tobacco and mildew. Its walls were blotched with old moisture, the floor sticky with whatever had come before. When Rutherford led the coffle inside, buyers were already waiting, men who could recognize muscle beneath exhaustion, the way butchers judge meat. But when Sarah ducked through the doorway, the chatter fell apart like cloth split down a seam. She was barefoot, wrists chained, her dress stiff with travel dirt. The clerk looked up, blinked once, and wrote Lot 19, Sarah. His hand hovered a moment longer, then added unusual stature. The trader pushed her forward, and as she stepped into the square of light beneath the ceiling window, something in the room shifted. The air seemed to tighten, even the flies circled slower, as if afraid to land. A man near the wall crossed himself. Another murmured that she must have some giant blood from the Congo. A third laughed to cover his unease and shouted, "Make her lift something." It became a dare. Someone rolled a half-barrel of rice toward her, the iron hoops scraping the floor. Rutherford told her to show them. She bent, fingers curling beneath the wood, and lifted. The sound of it was simple: a breath in, a hinge creaking, and then she was standing, the barrel resting against her hip, as though it were a basket of laundry. Gasps filled the hall. One man whispered, "Lord save us." She could tear the roof off. The bidding began, and what started as spectacle turned to frenzy. $400, $600, $900. Voices rose, each one sharper, greedier. Men shouted numbers over each other, red-faced and laughing. In that strange way laughter and cruelty often share. Sarah said nothing. Her face was unreadable, her eyes unfocused, as if staring through the crowd into something much farther away. She had learned, long before, that stillness could be a weapon. Stillness could make a man doubt his power. Then the final bid came, $1,300, and the room exhaled as one. The buyer was Josiah Crane, a planter whose reputation rode before him like thunder. He was not the richest man in Charleston, but he was one of the proudest, and pride has its own currency. He approached the platform, inspecting the prize like a craftsman judging stone. Her height forced him to look upward, and that small humiliation stung him immediately. "Sarah," he repeated, tasting the name. "That'll do." He signed the papers, his pen cutting into the parchment like a blade. The ink bled and dried almost instantly in the thick heat. Crane's property mark, a crude JC burned into a small leather tag, was fixed to the collar around her neck. The audience applauded softly. the polite rhythm of men pretending they had not just watched a human life sold for the price of a carriage team. Outside, the air hit like a wall, humid, heavy, sweet with the smell of salt and rot. The wagon waited. Rutherford handed Crane the purchase papers, wiped sweat from his brow, and said, "You've bought yourself a miracle or a curse. See ya. Time will tell which." Crane's reply was as dry as the dust rising behind them. "A miracle that earns its keep is all I require." The road to Marshbend cut through miles of tidal marsh and pine. The cries of unseen birds rose and fell like a warning. Sarah sat in the back of the wagon, wrists bound, the chains clinking softly in rhythm with the wheels. Every few minutes, the driver's eyes flicked toward her, curiosity laced with superstition. She kept her gaze on the horizon, where the sky sank into a flat, endless green. Marshbend appeared at dusk, a ghost of white columns rising from the reeds. Fireflies pulsed in the shadows. The swamp hummed with frogs and mosquitoes. The mansion stood on a slight rise, pretending to be above its own misery. Behind it, the fields spread outward like a green sea, sliced by narrow dikes and wooden floodgates. Smoke curled from the slave cabins in a line along the water's edge. When Sarah stepped down from the wagon, the overseer stared, mouth open. He later wrote to his brother that the new woman was a sight unfit for the imagination, her hands as broad as shovels, her face solemn as judgment. She had to stoop to enter the cabin, assigned to her. Inside, 5 women sat around a small fire, their eyes wide and silent. The tallest of them offered Sarah a tin cup of water without speaking. Sarah drank, nodded once, and sat in the corner. Outside, Crane paced the veranda with a glass of brandy, replaying the day's auction in his mind. $1,300. A fortune. Yes, but one he would multiply tenfold. He would make her the center of his domain, a living curiosity to display. He would show Charleston what kind of man Josiah Crane was, powerful enough to own even nature's mistakes. Down in the quarters, the women whispered prayers too quiet to hear. One, the eldest, crossed herself and muttered, "That man bought his own death." The next morning, the sun rose over the marshes like a burning coin. Work began before the mist had lifted, and the smell of mud and salt filled every breath. Sarah joined the line of women wading into the flooded fields, her dress clinging to her legs. The overseer barked orders, his voice carrying over the drone of insects. The water was warm and thick, crawling with leeches. Each movement stirred clouds of silt that smelled of decay. For hours, the workers bent at the waist, planting and weeding, their reflections trembling in the mirror of the flooded paddy. Sarah moved with mechanical strength, lifting, carrying, obeying, but her eyes never left the horizon. By noon, Crane had returned from Charleston with visitors. He called for her to be brought up to the veranda. "Let them see," he said. The overseer hesitated but obeyed. Sarah was made to stand before them, shoulders squared, eyes forward. "Gentlemen," Crane announced, his voice thick with pride, "behold what Marshbend breeds now. Not mere laborers, but marvels." He had her lift an anvil that 2 men could barely budge, the metal groaning in her grasp. Laughter rippled through the crowd. A doctor stepped forward, taking notes in a small book, describing her like an anatomical specimen, female of great height and unusual strength, of good posture and uncommon composure. Sarah heard none of it. Her gaze drifted past them to the marsh, to the distant black line of forest where cypress knees broke the water. Somewhere in that darkness, she imagined, lay the part of the world that had not yet been owned. That night, she sat alone outside the cabin. The others slept. Exhausted, the air was still. A lone owl called from the trees, answered only by silence. She rubbed at the welted skin beneath her collar, feeling the faint raised edge of the brand that marked her as Crane's property. The stars above the swamp shimmered like faraway embers, indifferent and unreachable. In the stillness, Sarah whispered the single sentence she would ever speak to the night at Marshbend. "They think they bought my body." She paused, her breath shallow, almost smiling. but they will never own my ending. The summer of 1823 arrived like a fever that never broke. The marsh steamed under its own weight, and the air hung heavy with rotten sweetness. At Marshbent, the rice paddies shimmered like mirrors in the noon sun, their still surfaces broken only by the bending backs of those who worked them. Mosquitoes clouded the sky so thickly that even the overseer began to wrap cloth around his mouth. The swamp, the heat, the constant hum of insects, it all pressed down on the plantation until time itself felt swollen and slow. Sarah learned quickly. She learned the rhythm of the tides, the way the water gates had to be opened, just so, how the salt in the air changed the feel of the mud beneath her feet. But she also learned the language of fear, the subtle ways people avoided looking directly at Crane, the silence that fell when the overseer's boots crunched on the path. The fields were filled with noise shovels, frogs, the drone of insects, but fear always made the loudest sound. From her first week, Sarah noticed how the other workers treated her, at first with curiosity, then with awe, and finally with a quiet reverence that frightened even them. When she carried barrels that required 2 men, when she hoisted floodgates without help, whispers followed her like shadows. God's own iron. Someone muttered once, "The wall." Another said, "The name's stuck." And Josiah Crane, seated on the veranda with his pipe, heard those whispers too. He had paid $1,300 not for a worker, but for a legend in the making. Within weeks, he began inviting guests, neighbors, merchants, even passing travelers to witness his giantess. The visits became ritual. Crane would stand proudly beside her, gesturing for her to lift sacks of rice or timber beams, to stretch out her hands so the men could measure them with their own. He always laughed too loudly, as though he feared silence more than ridicule. In his diary, one of the few surviving documents of Marshbent, Crane wrote, "The woman fascinates all who see her. Even those who feign disgust cannot look away. Her size defies nature's proportion. I intend to make her the emblem of Marshbent, a living testament to what order and ownership can accomplish." He believed the words, even as he wrote them, but Sarah's silence unsettled him. She never spoke unless spoken to, never cried out even when punished. That stillness, what Crane mistook for obedience, began to feel like a mirror turned back on him, reflecting something small and fragile that he couldn't name. By midsummer, word of Marshbent's giant slave woman had reached Charleston proper. Doctors came to Gawk. A physician named Dr. Edmund Porcher visited in May and wrote a report for the local medical society. His account survives in the archives, a mixture of scientific curiosity and moral blindness. The specimen stands at least 6.5 feet, perhaps more, her extremities of such magnitude that my hand appeared childlike within hers. Her strength astonishing, she lifted a barrel of rice, near 300 pounds, with ease. I confess to an unease upon viewing her nature, having perhaps overreached herself. Porcher's letter was read aloud at a meeting in Charleston that month. The men laughed, passing it around like a parlor curiosity. Back at Marshbent, Crane's pride swelled. He began to believe he had been chosen by Providence to own, to exhibit, to prove control over even the most unnatural of beings. But that illusion would not last. Sarah's life, outside those humiliating exhibitions, was a slow, grinding endurance. Each day began before dawn. When the quarters stirred under the overseer's whistle, the workers filed into the paddies, their feet sinking into the same water that bred fever and snakes. They worked from sunrise until the sky bruised into evening. There was no mercy, no pause, only the endless sound of insects and the creak of wooden yokes. Rice cultivation in the low country was among the most lethal forms of labor in the Americas. The water carried disease. The heat drove men to madness. Death was so common that fresh graves were dug weekly, the mounds small and unmarked. New shipments of enslaved workers arrived each month to replace the dead. The plantation system devoured people as efficiently as it grew profit. Sarah's endurance made her both useful and dangerous. She could do the work of 3, and Crane made sure she did. When her strength began to inspire the others, when the murmurs of admiration became murmurs of hope, Crane turned that strength into spectacle. Punishment became performance. If a worker faltered, he called for Sarah to stand nearby, to watch as the whip cracked across another's back. If someone hesitated, he made Sarah demonstrate how swiftly obedience could be forced. She was never the one punished for failing, but for reminding him of his weakness. The first punishment came over nothing. Crane ordered her to kneel when he spoke. She did not. He had her tied to the post in front of the cabins and lashed 20 times. She did not cry out. She did not move. When the overseer hesitated, unnerved by the silence, Crane struck the final lash himself, his breath ragged. The next day, Sarah returned to the fields as if nothing had happened. The scars healed into faint silver lines that caught the sunlight when she bent to work. By late August, the overseer, Porter Grimble, wrote another letter to his brother. It survives in brittle ink at the South Carolina Historical Society. The woman unnerves the men. She moves among them like something from scripture. The master takes pride in her. Yet I swear I have seen her look at him as one looks at a snake. I do not think she fears him. That alone is dangerous. Crane ignored Grimble's unease. He began bringing her to town more often, parading her before friends. Each showing fed his vanity, but also deepened something else, resentment. Because even in the middle of her humiliation, Sarah never looked small. She never flinched. It gnawed at him that this woman, this thing he owned, could look at him without submission. One evening, after the guests had gone, Crane poured himself another drink and stared at her through the parlor window. She was standing in the yard, moonlight catching the line of her shoulders, the faint shimmer of sweat on her arms. She seemed carved from the same stone as the columns that held up his house solid. Silent, indifferent, in his brandied haze, he muttered, "She thinks herself more than I am." He was right, and though he could not yet name it, what he saw that night was the beginning of his undoing. Sarah had endured beatings, hunger, and humiliation, but she had also learned the shape of Crane's cruelty. She saw how it bent others, how it fed on fear, and she began to imagine, quietly, what it might mean to take that power away, not with words, but with the same silent force that ruled her life. For now, she waited. The marsh outside pulsed with unseen life, the chorus of frogs and insects rising and falling like breath. In the quarters, a child cried and was hushed. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled soft, prescient, inevitable. The overseer would later remember that night as the first time he dreamed of her standing in the swamp, waist deep in dark water, watching the house burn in the distance. It was just a dream, but sometimes dreams are simply history rehearsing itself. By the spring of 1824, the marsh was blooming again, green and deceptive, its beauty hiding the same sickness that had lived there for centuries. The air hummed with gnats, the water steamed with heat, and the people of Marshbend worked as though the sun itself owned them. But beneath the endless rhythm of work and punishment, something unseen was shifting, something slow and dangerous, like pressure beneath the earth. Sarah had become both Crane's prized possession and his unspoken terror. He relied on her strength to keep his plantation running. Yet every time he looked at her, a shadow passed over his pride. Her presence reminded him of his own limits, his own smallness. It was as though he had purchased not a woman, but a mirror, one that refused to flatter him. Still, he found ways to turn her into profit. The exhibition parties continued. By now, Charleston society whispered about the giantess of Marshbend, and Crane basked in the attention. On weekends, carriages arrived from the city, bringing planters and their wives, merchants, even a few European travelers hungry for southern curiosities. The ritual was always the same. Crane would have Sarah stand before the guests, barefoot on the veranda boards, her height making even the tallest men seem diminished. He would boast, 6'8", gentleman strength beyond belief. Then he'd order her to lift barrels, iron tools, livestock, anything that would prove his ownership of the extraordinary. Once, when a visitor from Savannah doubted her power, Crane made her carry a young mule across the yard. The animal kicked and screamed, but Sarah held it fast, her arms like iron. When she set it down, she wiped her hands on her dress and looked directly at Crane. No words passed between them, but something in that gaze made him step back without realizing why. That night, he drank himself into silence. But what unsettled him most was not her strength, it was her refusal to show fear. Crane could command obedience from every man and woman on his property. He could make them tremble, beg, break, but not her. Sarah obeyed, yet she did not yield, and in that difference, Crane felt mocked by his own creation. The overseer, Porter Grimble, saw the same thing. In a letter dated July 1824, he wrote, "She frightens the master, though he would never admit it. When she stands near him, he shifts his weight as if her shadow pressed on his chest. I have seen him stare at her as though measuring which of them God intended to rule." That same summer, a man named Augustus Peyton, a traveling showman from Charleston, arrived with an offer that changed everything. Peyton organized exhibitions of oddities, two-headed calves, mechanical wonders, preserved sea monsters in jars. When he heard of Crane's giant slave woman, he saw profit. He offered Crane $300 to lend Sarah for 2 weeks, to display her in Charleston as the main attraction of his traveling cabinet of natural curiosities. Crane loved the idea. Not only would it earn him money, but it would elevate his name among Charleston's elite. He pictured the applause, the attention, the whispers of admiration for the man who owned the tallest woman in America. He agreed instantly. When he told Sarah of his plan, expecting silent compliance, she simply looked at him and said quietly, "No." Crane blinked, unsure he'd heard her correctly. "What did you say?" Her voice was calm, steady. "I will not go." The words landed like a gunshot. In all the months she had been at Marsh Bend, she had never directly refused him. The room went still. Even the overseer, standing nearby, froze. Crane's face reddened. "You forget yourself." "Woman," he hissed, "you belong to me. You will go where I say, when I say." Sarah did not answer. She only stared at him, those dark eyes unreadable. Unflinching, Crane's voice rose, cracking under its own fury. "Grimble, take her to the post." The overseer hesitated. "Sir, perhaps." Now Crane barked. They dragged her outside, to the whipping post near the cabins. The other workers gathered, summoned by the shouts. The air was thick with dread. Everyone had seen punishment before, but this felt different. It was not about discipline, it was about pride. 4 men were ordered to hold her. They gripped her arms and shoulders, but she didn't struggle. She only stood still, feet planted in the dust like roots sunk deep in the earth. The men strained, pushing, pulling. She didn't move. Her body became immovable mass, her silence an act of rebellion. "Get her to the post," Crane shouted. But even the overseer's whip could not make her bend. At last, one of the men shouted in desperation, "She'll crush us if she moves." Crane's fury turned to desperation. He ordered ropes, threads, more men. Finally, when they threatened to punish the others if she didn't comply, Sarah let them lead her forward, not out of fear for herself, but for them. The whipping that followed was one of the cruelest on record at Marsh Bend. 30 lashes with a braided whip. Flesh split. Blood streaked down her back, staining the dirt. The sound was sickening wet, rhythmic, relentless. But through it all, she made no sound. Not a scream, not a plea, not even a breath louder than the wind. By the 20th lash, even the overseer was trembling. Crane finished it himself, his arm shaking with exhaustion and rage. When it was over, Sarah straightened, walked back to her cabin without help, and closed the door behind her. Inside, the other women tended her wounds with rags soaked in salt water and herbs. One wept quietly. Sarah only said, "It's done." Then she lay down and slept. Crane, meanwhile, sent word to Peyton that the arrangement was cancelled. His excuse, the woman has fallen ill, but in truth, he feared bringing her into the city again. The thought of her standing before hundreds of strangers, people who might see in her something powerful rather than monstrous, unnerved him. From that day forward, he stopped calling her the marvel and began calling her the problem. The plantation changed subtly after that. The punishments became rarer, though no less brutal. The workers moved differently in Sarah's presence, straighter, quieter, as if she had drawn a boundary no one could explain. The overseer avoided her eyes. Crane began drinking more, muttering that the place was cursed. But in the quarters, the whispers grew louder. Some said she could not be killed by a whip. Others said she had been chosen by something older than the white men's god, something that lived in the swamp and remembered every lash. When children were born sick, mothers carried them to her, asking her to touch them. When fights broke out, her shadow at the door was enough to end them. One night, an old man said softly, "The wall doesn't just stand, the wall protects." By winter, even Crane began to sense it, the shift in the air, the quiet unity forming under his nose. And though he didn't yet know it, the moment he raised that whip in the summer of 1824 was the moment he lost control of Marshbend forever. Winter crept over the low country in silence. The rice fields, once slick with green, turned to grey water and dead stalks. The nights came early and long, filled with the sound of the river shifting under its own cold weight. At Marshbend, even the air seemed exhausted. But inside the slave quarters, life stirred quietly in defiance of the season. Sarah was changing. Her body, already massive, moved slower now. The women who shared her cabin noticed before she said anything how she paused to steady herself when standing, how she pressed a hand to her belly after lifting heavy buckets. In January of 1826, it became clear she was with child. No one asked who the father was. They didn't need to. Marcus, the carpenter, had been at Marshbend for 2 years by then, a man of skill and stillness. Like Sarah herself, he worked on the rice mill and the floodgates, his hands always smelling faintly of pine, tar, and river water. He was not tall, not imposing, but his presence carried a calm authority that others trusted. He spoke rarely, and when he did, people listened. He and Sarah had been drawn to each other long before words passed between them. At night, when the day's labor ended and the fields glowed faintly under the moon, they would sit outside, cabin 7, saying little. Sometimes Marcus would carve small wooden figures, toys, bits of beauty in a place that had none. Sometimes he'd simply tell her about the world beyond the swamp, the markets of Georgetown, the sound of waves near Beaufort, the smell of cedar. She listened in silence, the corner of her mouth softening, as though remembering what peace once felt like. They found in each other something rare on a plantation: recognition. When she told him she was pregnant, he didn't smile, didn't speak. He only reached out and placed his hand over hers, the gesture quiet but certain. That night, he carved a small wooden horse, the first toy for a child that had not yet been born. For a time, even Marshbend seemed to breathe easier. The overseer ignored what he must have known, and the other women took care of Sarah, carrying extra water, trading portions of food. In that fragile peace, Sarah began to hope for something she had never allowed herself before: a future. But Josiah Crane noticed, too. At first, he said nothing. He watched. His curiosity, once prideful, became calculating. A child born of such size and strength could be valuable, he thought. He began making notes in his ledgers. The woman's offspring may be exceptional stock. To Crane, even life was a ledger entry waiting to be balanced. By spring, Sarah's condition was visible to everyone. Crane began bringing her lighter work, mending, shelling rice, tending the kitchen garden. But the change wasn't mercy. It was ownership disguised as care. He wanted the child alive and healthy for himself. The plantation's gossip reached Charleston quickly. Neighbors joked crudely that Crane's giantess was breeding a future fortune. When visitors came, he made remarks that hovered between fascination and possession. "Imagine," he said once, "glass of brandy in hand, A boy half her size would fetch a king's ransom by 16. His guests laughed, but even they shifted uneasily. There was something indecent about his tone, even among men who made profit from flesh. Sarah heard him one evening. She was standing just outside the open window, holding a basket of laundry. She froze, listening, as Crane speculated about her unborn child like a horse breeder, discussing bloodlines. Her heart pounded not from rage, but from the kind of terror that settles deep, beyond trembling. That night, she went to Marcus and told him everything. He listened in silence, his face dark with thought. When she finished, he said only, "He will not take what's ours." Sarah looked at him. He already thinks it's his. The baby came on a night of bitter cold. January 27th. The wind screamed through the cracks in the cabin walls, and the river moaned against its banks. Sarah labored for hours. Her body trembling with pain, she refused to give voice to. 2 women attended her: Hester, old and steady, and Dina, who whispered prayers between contractions. Crane, restless in the main house, sent the overseer to check twice. "If she dies, the child must live," he said coldly. But Sarah did not die. Just before dawn, the air split with a cry, a single, fierce sound, both fragile and alive. A boy, 11 pounds, broad-shouldered, his skin the same deep tone as his mother's. When Sarah held him for the first time, something broke open inside her. She wept without restraint, the tears falling silently onto his face. She named him Jacob. Marcus was allowed to see her briefly. He entered the cabin quietly, his arm still bandaged from a recent accident at the mill. When he saw the child, he stopped short, his eyes softening. Sarah looked up, exhausted but proud. "He's strong," she whispered. "Marcus knet besilher," touching the baby's hand. "Then he'll survive this place." For the first time since her arrival at Marshbend, Sarah smiled. In the weeks that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Sarah worked light duties around the kitchen, Jacob always tied to her back in a cloth sling. Marcus built them a sturdier cradle, sanding it smooth and carving a small pattern of waves along the edges, a nod to the river that both sustained and imprisoned them. Even the overseer seemed gentler, though whether from pity or fear, no one knew. Among the enslaved, the birth brought hope. They whispered that maybe the child marked a change, a sign that life could still grow in soil watered by cruelty. But hope is a dangerous thing on a plantation. By the summer of 1827, Crane's financial troubles deepened. His rice harvest had failed, and his creditors were circling like vultures. He needed money fast, and Marshbend's only true wealth lay in the people who worked it. One humid afternoon, a trader named Nathaniel Gadsden arrived in a creaking wagon. He was known in Charleston as a man who dealt in debt, the kind of trader who bought people not to keep, but to resell for profit farther south. He was lean, sharp-eyed, and smiling in a way that never touched his face. Crane led him across the plantation, listing ages and skills as though reciting inventory. They passed the cabins, the rice mill, the kitchen garden, until they reached the spot where Sarah stood, Jacob sleeping on her back. Gadsden stopped. "Lord Almighty," he said softly, "that the one they talk about?" Crane nodded. "The same. And the child?" 6 months. Gadsden stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the baby. "Fine boy. Strong arms already. I might have a buyer for one like that, a house family in Savannah. Wants to train a child young. Good life. Gentle work." Crane frowned. "He's too young to sell." "Too young now," Gadsden agreed, smiling thinly. "But the right buyer will pay for potential. 400. Cash today. I'll take him with me this afternoon." Sarah had stopped moving. The hoe in her hands hung mid-air. Her back stiffened. She did not turn, but every line of her body went still. Crane hesitated. He wanted to refuse, but the number echoed in his mind, $400, enough to quiet one of his creditors, to keep Marshbend afloat a little longer. Gadsden shrugged. The offer won't last. Josiah, cash in hand. Later, witnesses would remember that silence, the kind that feels like the air itself, deciding what kind of world it wants to be. Then Crane nodded once. I'll consider it. He walked away, but everyone knew. He didn't need to consider. He needed the money. That night, Sarah sat in the corner of her cabin, Jacob in her lap. The candle flickered low. Marcus paced the floor, whispering to her, urgent and afraid. They both knew what Crane's decision would be. Marcus reached for her hand. I'll go to Charleston, he said. I'll find anyone to help. It's too far, she said. He shook his head. Not for him. They stayed that way for a long time, the baby asleep between them, the air heavy with the sound of the river outside. Then Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. Go. Marcus kissed Jacob's forehead, then looked at her one last time. You keep him safe until I come back. He left before dawn. No one saw him again alive. The morning Marcus left, the mist hung so thick over the rice fields that the cabins looked like they were floating. He moved through the fog quietly, a shadow among shadows, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a small scrap of paper tucked inside his shirt, a map of the road to Charleston, drawn by his own hand. Inside the lining, stitched there by Sarah's careful fingers, lay a letter written in his rough but steady script. It read, To any who read this in Charleston, please. I beg you, there is a man named Josiah Crane who means to sell an infant child born of one of his slaves. The mother is strong but has no power to stop him. He asks for help, for mercy, for any who still know the word. The child's name is Jacob. He had no reason to believe anyone would read it, or that help would come, even if they did. But it was something. It was hope shaped into ink. By mid-morning, Marcus was gone, swallowed by the marsh, when the overseer told Crane that one of his carpenters had run away. The planter's face went red with rage. Marcus, he shouted, that man owes me half a boat's worth of timber. Find him. He sent riders down every road and across every bridge. He called for the slave patrol, armed men with dogs, paid in bounty and rum. The swamps that had once hidden life now became a trap. They found Marcus before noon, just 8 miles from Marshbend. He had tried to cross a creek, but the mud had pulled him down to his knees, slowing him until the dogs reached him first. They tore into his arms and legs before the men dragged them off. By the time they brought him back, his face was grey with pain, his breathing shallow. Crane stood waiting in the yard when they arrived. Bring him to the post, he said, his voice cold and clear. The punishment was swift and deliberate. Every worker on the plantation was forced to watch. Sarah was made to stand at the front, Jacob in her arms. The overseer hesitated, but Crane insisted on delivering the lashes himself. 50 strokes. The first few broke skin, the last tore muscle. By the time it ended, Marcus was barely conscious, his body sagging against the ropes. Sarah did not move. Her face was carved from stone. Only Jacob stirred, crying softly against her chest. When Crane turned to her, his face slick with sweat, she met his gaze without blinking. Remember this, he said, breathing hard. Tomorrow, Mr. Gadsden returns for your boy. You will hand him over quietly. If you resist, Marcus dies again. Do you understand me? She said nothing. That night, the plantation fell into a silence, so heavy it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The frogs were quiet, the river still. In the cabins, no one spoke. Even the children sensed that something was wrong beyond words. Sarah sat on the floor beside Marcus, who lay on his stomach, his back a ruin of open wounds. The other women had cleaned them as best they could, smearing herbs and grease into the torn flesh. He was half conscious, muttering fevered words she couldn't understand. She touched his shoulder gently. They'll take him tomorrow, she said softly. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was clarity. He turned his head slightly. It was enough to see her face. You do what you must, he whispered. I don't know what that is, she replied. Yes, you do. His breath rattled. You always did. Outside, the wind picked up, bending the grass. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled. When she finally stood, Marcus's eyes had already closed again. He was breathing, but only barely. She looked down at him for a long time before whispering, "Rest." Then she turned to Jacob, asleep in his cradle. She brushed her fingers through his hair, feeling the warmth of his small body. "They won't take you," she said. "Not while I can still stand." The next morning, August 14th, Etienne Baba Archetsi, dawned under a blood-red sky. The air was thick with heat, the kind that pressed against the lungs. Crane was already awake, pacing the veranda, glancing down the road every few minutes for the arrival of the trader. Sarah worked the kitchen garden. As she had been ordered, she moved methodically, her face blank. The other women kept their distance. Some prayed, others simply couldn't bear to watch. Around midday, a wagon appeared through the haze, drawn by 2 tired mules. Nathaniel Gadsden stepped down, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. He tipped his hat toward Crane. "Morning, Josiah. Fine day for business." Crane forced a smile. "You brought the money." Gadsden patted his coat. 400. Cash. The 2 men went inside to finalize the paperwork. A short document, no more than a paragraph, changed ownership of 1 male infant named Jacob, age 6 months. Crane's signature appeared at the bottom, the ink blotting slightly where his hand shook. When the deal was done, Crane sent word to the quarters, "Bring the woman and her child to the main house." The messenger was a young house servant named Ruth. She walked to the garden, trembling. When she told Sarah that Mr. Crane required her presence, Sarah looked up, nodded once, and wiped her hands on her dress. She went to her cabin, picked up Jacob, and wrapped him in the small cotton blanket she had sewn the week before. Then she walked toward the big house, her steps steady, her expression unreadable. The workers watched her pass. Some began to cry. Others whispered prayers into their hands. Not one dared to follow. Inside the library, Crane and Gadsden stood waiting. The room smelled of brandy and sweat. Papers were scattered across the desk. The pistol that Crane sometimes kept nearby lay within reach. Sarah entered and stopped, just inside the doorway, Jacob in her arms. The men stared at her, the size of her, the calmness that clung to her like fog. Crane gestured impatiently. "Step forward." She did. 3 slow steps. Then she stopped again. "Sarah," he said, forcing civility into his tone, "you will hand the child to Mr. Gadsden. It's done." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, in a voice no louder than a whisper, she said, "Please." Crane frowned. "What?" "Please," she said again, her voice trembling now. "Don't take him. I will work harder. I will do anything. Just don't take him." Gadsden shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Crane. "Maybe." Crane cut him off. The matter settled. Sarah's arms tightened around Jacob. The baby stirred, sensing the tension, and began to cry. The sound filled the room like a living wound. "Sarah," Crane said coldly, "you forget your place. Hand him over. Now." Her lips trembled. She bent her head, kissed Jacob's forehead once, and then slowly, with hands that shook for the first time in her life, she held him out toward Gadsden. The trader took the baby gently, perhaps more gently than she expected. Jacob cried louder as he was lifted away, his small hands reaching for her face. In that instant, something in Sarah's expression changed. The pain drained away, replaced by something colder. "Quieter." Crane exhaled, as if relieved. "He'll be treated well," he said softly. "You'll work, and in time you'll have others." She looked at him, her voice steady again. "No, he won't." Then she turned and walked out of the room. Neither man followed her. Outside, the sky had darkened with storm clouds. Gadsden climbed into his wagon, Jacob still crying in his arms. The wheels turned. creaking over the dirt. Sarah stood near the edge of the yard, watching as the wagon disappeared down the long drive toward the main road. She did not move for nearly an hour. When the last trace of dust had settled, she turned and walked toward the cabins. That evening, she visited Marcus. He was awake. Barely. His eyes met hers. "Is he gone?" he asked. She nodded. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Then it's done." Sarah shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." She sat beside him for a long time. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air around them felt thick, charged, as if the storm outside had moved indoors. When she finally rose, Marcus whispered, "You do what you have to do." She didn't answer. She stepped out into the night, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. In her cabin, the cradle sat empty. The candle burned low. She stared at it until the wax ran down the side and hardened into thin parley rivers. Then she blew it out. Darkness swallowed the room. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer, this time, deeper, and Sarah Drummond walked into it. The night of August 14th, 1827 began like any other at Marshbend, humid, breathless, and still, but those who later tried to recall it said there was a weight to the air. A waiting. The sky was bruised with the remnants of the storm that had passed earlier. The moon veiled in thin, racing clouds. Crickets hissed in the reeds. Frogs croaked in the ditches. And from far away the river gave off a faint metallic smell, as if the water itself sensed blood was near. Inside the great house, Josiah Crane sat alone in his library. The brandy decanter was half empty. His ledger books lay open in front of him, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the distant glow of the slave quarters. Every sound from outside the creak of wood. The rustle of grass seemed to reach him sharper than usual. Somewhere beyond those fields, he thought, his newest prophet was already halfway to Savannah. He should have felt satisfaction. Instead, something colder had taken root. In his mind, the image of Sarah handing over her child played again and again. The look she had given him, empty and vast, had unsettled him in a way no man ever had. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fury. It was something worse. A silence that promised return. He poured another glass of brandy, the liquid trembling slightly in his hand. Upstairs, the servants had long since gone to bed. Only Ruth, the housemaid, remained awake, folding linens in the upstairs hall. The overseer had retired to his cottage, exhausted from a day that had stretched into uneasy evening. The house, for all its grandeur, felt hollow, its quiet, not peace, but anticipation. Out in the quarters, Sarah sat in her cabin, her back against the wall, staring at the cradle Marcus had built. The blanket still lay folded inside, untouched since that morning. Her eyes reflected the candlelight, steady and unblinking. No one knew what thoughts passed through her then, what balance of memory and pain, what shapes her rage took. But she moved with purpose. Shortly after 9, she stood, pulled on her torn work dress, and stepped outside. The air was heavy with the smell of wet grass and wood smoke. A few people still stirred in nearby cabins, whispering to each other in low tones. When they saw her pass, they fell silent. Old Solomon, the field hand who'd worked Marshbend longer than anyone alive, saw her silhouette cross the yard and called out softly, "Where you going?" "Wall." She didn't answer. She only kept walking, her huge frame gliding through the shadows toward the main house. The kitchen door creaked softly as she pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark, except for the faint glow from a lamp in the library. She moved like someone who knew every inch of the place, the boards that groaned, the stairs that held their breath, the hallway that always smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. Ruth heard it first, a voice, faint but sharp, from below. Crane's voice, then another sound lower, quieter, familiar. She froze. It was Sarah. From the landing, Ruth could see a sliver of light spilling from the library door. She crept down 2 steps, her heart hammering. The voices grew clearer. Crane, how dare you enter this house? Sarah quietly, you took him. Crane, get out, or I'll have you whipped till you can't stand. A pause. Then Sarah again, her tone unchanged. You took him. Ruth reached the bottom of the stairs, every instinct telling her to run, but she couldn't. She moved closer, just enough to see through the crack of the open door. Crane was standing behind his desk, the pistol from the drawer in his hand. His face was pale, his shirt open at the collar. Sweat clung to his temples. Sarah stood opposite him, her head nearly brushing the ceiling. Her dress clung to her frame, dark with rain. Where is my son? She asked. Crane's voice shook. Gone. Sold. The law gives me that right. He's mine, was mine, and so were you. Sarah took one slow step forward. No, you never owned me. You never could. Stop, Crane barked. I'll shoot you. By God, I will. Another step. He raised the pistol with both hands. I said stop. The gun went off. The sound filled the house, shattering the silence, shaking dust from the ceiling beams. Ruth screamed. Smoke rolled through the doorway, acrid and heavy. When it cleared, Sarah was still standing. The bullet had struck her left shoulder. Blood spread across her dress in a widening bloom, but her face didn't change. Her gaze didn't waver. She looked down at the pistol, then back at Crane, who was frantically trying to reload with trembling fingers. Where is my son? She repeated. Crane's voice broke. I told you I don't know where Gadsden took him, I swear to God. I don't. Sarah's massive hand swept the pistol from his grasp. It flew across the room, clattering against the far wall. Crane stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the desk. Please, he said, breath ragged. We can fix this. I'll bring him back. I'll buy him back. But Sarah was already moving. Later, Ruth would struggle to describe what she saw. She said Sarah's face was calm, too calm, that she reached out and took Crane by the head, her hands spanning from temple to jaw, that he tried to scream, but no sound came, that the sound that followed was like a melon splitting under weight, and then there was nothing but stillness. Ruth ran. She bolted from the house, screaming for help, her cries slicing through the thick night air. The overseer came first, followed by 2 field hands armed with torches and a rifle. They stormed the main house, hearts pounding, not knowing what they would find. The library door was still open. The lamplight flickered over the carnage. Crane lay sprawled on the floor beside his desk. His face, what was left of it, was unrecognizable, the skull crushed inward. Blood splattered across the shelves and walls. Books lay scattered, their pages soaked red. A trail of blood led from the desk to the open window. The window looked out over the fields and swamps beyond. The humid wind pushed the curtains inward, carrying the faint smell of rain and river water. Sarah was gone. The men searched the house, calling her name as if she might answer. Then they followed the blood trail outside through the garden, across the yard, toward the marsh. It was easy to follow at first, bright against the pale dirt. Then, at the edge of the swamp, it vanished. The water reflected the moon like a sheet of glass. The reeds swayed. Somewhere deep inside, an alligator bellowed. They searched until dawn. No body, no footprints, no sound but the insects and the wind. When the sun rose, the men stood in the steaming light, exhausted and afraid. The overseer finally spoke what all of them were thinking. She's gone. Gone, where? One of the men asked. He looked toward the endless maze of swamp and water, where we can't follow. That morning, the slaves of Marshbend were gathered and ordered to remain silent. The magistrate from Charleston was summoned. The doctor arrived to examine the body. The coroner's report would later read, death caused by massive compression trauma to the skull was applied with force exceeding human norm. Evidence suggests hands of extraordinary size and power. The report did not mention Sarah's name, only that the suspect escaped into the surrounding wetlands and is presumed dead or fled. But in the quarters, a different story took root. They said she walked into the swamp carrying her chains in one hand and vanished beneath the trees. They said her blood colored the water that night and that the cypress roots rose to shelter her. Some claimed to have heard her voice in the dark, whispering her child's name. By the time the Charleston papers reported the story, it was already legend. The headlines read, "Planter murdered by enormous female slave. Monster vanishes into the swamp." But those who had known her, the ones who whispered her name only in the dark, did not call her a monster. They called her Mother of the Marsh, and they said that the last thing she touched on this earth was a man who thought he owned everything. When dawn broke over the rice fields of Marsh Bend on August 15th, it brought with it the first true silence the plantation had ever known. No sound of hammers, no overseer's whistle, no murmur of prayer, only the heavy stillness of fear. The mist hung low over the flooded paddies, and for once the cries of birds seemed distant, swallowed by the swamp. By mid-morning, word had already reached Charleston. A messenger on horseback, mud-spattered and pale, arrived at the magistrate's office, shouting about murder, about a planter's head crushed like fruit, about a woman gone into the swamps. Within hours, the story had spread across taverns, churches, and counting houses. The wealthy whispered about uprising, about revenge. The poor whispered about ghosts. By noon, the Charleston sheriff, William Huger, and a physician, Dr. James Pelot, were on the road to Marsh Bend with 2 deputies and a coroner's chest of instruments. The heat that day was unbearable. The air pressed down like a damp cloth. Even the horses labored, their hides streaked with sweat. When they arrived, they found a plantation in disarray. The enslaved people huddled near their cabins, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The overseer Grimble greeted them with a face so ashen, it made the sheriff pause. "In there," Grimble said, pointing toward the house. "He's still where we found him." The men entered the library. Dr. Pelot knelt beside the body. "Merciful God," he whispered. The smell of blood and lamp oil filled the air. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages fused with gore. The desk was overturned, and on the rug, Josiah Crane's body sprawled backward, skull shattered inward like soft clay. Pelot examined what was left with professional detachment, but his hand trembled. The skull collapsed under compression. He said quietly, "Hands did this, not tools." "Impossible," Hua replied. "No man could." "No man," Pelot interrupted. "But perhaps a woman of her size might." The doctor opened his ledger and began to dictate the report. Injury consistent with massive pressure applied manually to the cranium, exceeding ordinary human strength. Fractures radiate outward from temple to occipital. No evidence of weapon. Likely instantaneous death. He paused, glancing at the sheriff. "Her blood's here too." He pointed to the droplets leading toward the open window. Hugo followed the trail to the sill. The wood was darkened by rain and stained with rust-colored smears. Beyond it lay the dense, green chaos of the swamp. "She's wounded," he said. "The ball hit her left shoulder. According to witnesses, she can't have gone far." They organized a search immediately. Dozens of men with dogs spread into the cypress maze, torches flickering in the daylight gloom. They sloshed through knee-deep water, shouting her name, firing shots into the trees. But the swamp is not a place that gives back what it takes. The roots and reeds swallowed everything sound. Footprints, blood. By dusk, they returned empty-handed. The sheriff cursed under his breath. "If she's alive, she'll die out there. No food, no shelter. That wound, she'll bleed out before dawn." But Grimbal, the overseer, said nothing. He only stared toward the darkening horizon where the swamp shimmered faintly in the fading light. "You don't understand," he murmured. "She's not gone. She's waiting." That night, the body of Josiah Crane was placed in a pine coffin and taken to Charleston under guard. The enslaved people were forbidden to mourn, forbidden to speak. But when the cart rolled away down the dirt road, a low hum rose from the cabins, a sound that might have been prayer, or grief, or something older than both. The investigation lasted weeks. Testimonies were taken from everyone on the plantation. Ruth, still trembling, told them what she had seen: the confrontation, the gunshot, the impossible way Sarah kept standing. Isaac, the butler, confirmed hearing the shot and finding the blood trail. The other workers, terrified, repeated fragments. She went into the water. She called his name once. She never looked back. The magistrate recorded every word. There were questions, of course, about motive, about law. Could an enslaved woman be said to commit murder against a man who legally owned her? The court didn't know how to answer. The law was built to prevent justice, not to find it. In the end, they called it destruction of property under violent circumstances. No one mentioned the child, but stories began to spread nonetheless. Some said that on the night of the murder, the swamp had glowed faintly red, as if reflecting the blood in her veins. Others swore they heard singing in the dark, a woman's low voice, carrying the name Jacob through the cypress groves. The white newspapers called her a monster, a female Goliath, the demon woman of Charleston. The Charleston Mercury ran a lurid illustration of a towering black figure dragging a planter into the mud, captioned, "The giant murderous retribution in the low country." But among the enslaved, the story grew different. They whispered it from plantation to plantation, changing little but tone. She rose up, they said. She broke what couldn't be broken. They began to hum songs at night, soft enough not to be heard by the overseers. Wall of the marsh, strong and still, took the pain, paid the bill. Child gone north, mama gone deep. River keeper, river keep. The songs traveled farther than the search parties ever did. 3 weeks after the murder, a letter arrived at the Charleston magistrate's office. It had no return address. The postmark read Columbia, nearly 100 miles inland. The handwriting was crude but legible, the ink smeared in places by what might have been rain or blood. It said, "To those seeking the woman Sarah, I am not dead. I will not return. I go north to find my son. If any man tries to stop me, he will meet the same end as Josiah Crane." The magistrate, William Huger, held the letter for a long time before showing it to anyone. "She's alive," he finally said, more to himself than to his men. "God help us, she's alive." They debated authenticity. The letter contained details not made public: the injury to her shoulder, the exact words Crane had said before he died. Only someone present could have known them. They chose not to release it. Instead, copies were circulated quietly among the patrols and traders. The message was clear: watch for a woman of exceptional size, possibly wounded, traveling north. Rewards were offered. Rumors multiplied. A woman matching Sarah's description was seen near the Santee River, then in Georgetown, then somewhere along the Savannah Road. Each sighting ended the same way: too late. She was always gone by the time the men arrived, leaving only footprints in the mud or scraps of fabric snagged on thorns. And then, by winter, the sightings stopped altogether. The official record closed in 1828 with the words, "Fugitive presumed deceased." But in the fields and quarters of South Carolina, her name didn't fade. Old Solomon would tell the children, the wall walked into the swamp and came out on the other side of the world. Hester, the midwife, whispered to young mothers, "If your child cries at night, she hears him. She still listens for her baby." Even the overseers, when the fog rolled thick across the marshes, would glance uneasily toward the trees and mutter, "She's out there." Because fear, once born, doesn't it changes shape. And Sarah Drummond had become something more than a woman. She was a shape one carved from silence, grief, and the unthinkable strength of a mother who refused to surrender. A year later, a fisherman on the Ashley River claimed he found a piece of cloth tangled in a cypress root. It was coarse cotton, stained dark, with what looked like a handprint still visible in dried blood. He showed it to the local sheriff, who told him to burn it. The fisherman didn't. He buried it under his dock instead, whispering a prayer he couldn't quite remember. That night, The wind came in from the swamp, and the frogs fell silent again. For a time, Sarah Drummond was a ghost story. Plantation men told her name in low voices over whiskey, each insisting they had heard her footsteps in the swamps or seen her reflection in the water. Women hushed their children with warnings, behave, or the giant woman will come for you. But a year after Marshben's blood-soaked night, those whispers became something else, rumors of a woman too tall for any doorway, moving north under cover of darkness. In 1831, a group of escaped enslaved people who reached Pennsylvania through the Underground Railroad described being guided by a woman taller than any man, with a voice like thunder and hands that could lift a fallen tree. When asked her name, she said only, "I am looking for my son." That same year, a preacher in Georgia claimed to have seen a giant black woman kneeling in the woods, praying in a language I could not understand. He fled, believing her a spirit. By 1835, reports reached Charleston of a phantom woman who had attacked a patrol camp along the Savannah Road, breaking rifles, scattering men, leaving their dogs dead. The men swore she moved like the wind, and that when the torches fell upon her face, half of it gleamed with a jagged scar. The Charleston authorities dismissed it as myth, but the legends grew. In 1838, a plantation owner named Samuel Gillard recorded in his diary, "My overseer claims he saw the giant wench that killed Josiah Crane, says she stood at the tree line, silent as a statue, her eyes glinting in the dark. He fired once, but the shot did not reach her. When he ran closer, she was gone, leaving prints in the mud the size of dinner plates. I know not what to believe." Yet the dogs refused to go near that spot for days. What the law denied, the land itself seemed to confirm. Among the enslaved communities, Sarah's name became more than story. It became symbol. Songs told of her standing in the marsh, breaking her chains. Mothers taught their daughters, when they strike you, remember, the wall stood tall. Her legend spread northward, carried by those who escaped bondage. On the Underground Railroad, some conductors claimed to find caches of food and tools left in the wilderness, hidden by someone who knew the routes. A Quaker woman in Ohio wrote in her 1842 diary, "A woman of unusual height arrived at our door near midnight, seeking rest and news of a child sold from Charleston. She bore an old wound upon her shoulder and spoke little, save to say, 'The swamps remember me.' At dawn she was gone." No one knew if these encounters were truth or fiction, but the stories kept coming. Some said she walked all the way to Canada. Others claimed she haunted the forests of Virginia, helping fugitives vanish. And in every version, she was never caught. By the late 1842, the White South had twisted her legend into something grotesque. Newspapers rebranded her the she-devil of the marsh, claiming she had eaten men alive or conjured storms from the blood of her master. These stories justified new laws, harsher punishments, more chains. Yet even their fear could not erase her. In 1852, a pamphlet printed in Boston by abolitionist Maria Weston Chapman featured a poem titled "Sarah of the Swamp." Its final verse read, "Her hands were scarred, her voice unbowed. Her child was lost to trade and crowd. Yet through the reeds her footsteps ring a mother's wrath." An endless thing. It sold hundreds of copies, banned in the South, celebrated in the North. Then, silence again until 1889. In Philadelphia, a physician named Dr. Robert Hayes treated an elderly black woman dying of pneumonia. She spoke of the past in fragments, rice fields, chains. A boy named Jacob. Dr. Hayes, curious, began to ask gentle questions. On the third night, she said something that froze him. "My mother killed her master in South Carolina. They say she was a monster. She was not. She was tired." Hayes wrote in his journal, the woman claimed her mother was of giant stature and strength, that she fled north after killing a planter named Crane, and that she searched for her son for years before settling in Pennsylvania. She died quietly, calling a name Jacob. The doctor never learned the woman's name. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, That letter, forgotten for more than a century, resurfaced in 2003 when a historian found it among Civil War-era archives. The details matched every known fact of Marshbend the year. The name, even the crushed skull recorded in Charleston's coroner files. Could it have been true? Did Sarah survive? Did she crawl bleeding through the swamps, cross hundreds of miles of hostile land, and live to see her son's freedom? Or did she die there in the black water, her body consumed by the marsh that had long devoured bones and secrets alike? No one will ever know. What we do know is this: the death of Josiah Crane is no ghost story. His skull rests in Charleston's historical archives, its fractures still visible beneath glass. His name appears in plantation ledgers, beside a single notation dated August 14th. Etienne Barbe Archeti, lost one female hand. Property number 47. Gaussis Gabid. But history is written by the victors, and what they called escaped, others called freed. In the 1,930 seconds, when the Federal Writers Project interviewed the descendants of Jacob, the boy she had lost, they described a carpenter in Savannah who always carried a small wooden toy in his pocket. It was a horse, carved by his father Marcus before the sale. When asked about it, Jacob would smile and say, "It reminds me that my mama was strong." He named his first daughter Sarah. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since that August night at Marshbend. The plantation itself is gone, reclaimed by the river and the reeds. But when the tide rises and the fog drifts low, fishermen still swear they hear something moving among the cypress, footsteps too heavy for the earth, a voice murmuring a name long forgotten by men. Some say it's only the wind. Others say it's the marsh remembering. But those who listen closely, in the stillness before dawn, say they can make out the words, Jacob. Nearly 2 centuries later, the land where Marshbend once stood is little more than a ruin, a scar hidden beneath the cypress. The main house collapsed decades ago, its white columns sunken into the earth. The rice fields have turned back into swamp, overrun with reeds and herons. If you walk there today, you'll find the faint outlines of dikes beneath the water, the ghosts of levees long consumed by moss. And yet, the place still feels watched. Local fishermen call it the Silent Bend. They say no birds sing there, no frogs croak. The air, they whisper, goes cold even in summer. A few swear they've seen her, an impossibly tall woman moving through the mist, her dress dark with rain, her face hidden. When asked if she speaks, they all tell the same story. She says a name. They can't agree on what it is. Some say Jacob, others claim it's Crane. But whatever name she calls, the sound echoes across the water long after she's gone. Historians who revisit the case of Sarah Drummond face a strange paradox. Her life is one of the best documented mysteries in early American slavery, yet half of what we know comes not from records, but from whispers. The Charleston County Archives still keep Crane's coroner's report, signed by Dr. Pellot in 1827, the original auction ledger bearing Sarah's name, or rather, Sarah, female. Height, extraordinary remains preserved in faded ink. And yet, the official search reports end abruptly. There's no mention of her body. No grave. No possessions recovered. The magistrate's final note reads simply, "The fugitive woman is presumed deceased. No further pursuit necessary." For most, that would have been the end. But then came the letter from Columbia, and the later testimonies, those fragments that refused to let the story die. Each new piece blurred the line between history and myth a little more. Was she truly alive months later, traveling north with a wound that should have killed her? Could she really have evaded patrols across 4 states, sustained only by the kindness of strangers and her own will? Or had someone, another woman, perhaps adopted her name, carrying her legend forward like a torch? Even among scholars, opinion divide sharply. Some argue that the Columbia letter was a fabrication, written by an abolitionist to inspire resistance. Others insist its phrasing, "I go north to find my son," bears the same cadence described by witnesses at Marshbend, the same plain, unwavering voice, that had once refused to bow to Crane's command. What's undeniable is the effect her story left behind. In the years following her disappearance, hundreds of enslaved people across the Carolinas attempted escape through the very swamps that had hidden her. The success rate was small, but the pattern was clear. The overseers called it the Marsh Bend Curse. The slaves called it following the wall. To them, Sarah wasn't a ghost. She was a path after emancipation. Her name faded from official memory. The plantation records were lost or burned during the Civil War, but among freed families in the Low Country, the legend endured. Children learned it the way others learned bedtime prayers. She was tall as a tree and strong as truth. She broke the hand that held her chain. She walked into the swamp and didn't die. She walked till she found her child again. No one knew who wrote those lines. But by the early 1900s they appeared in oral folklore collections recorded by the Works Progress Administration. In one interview from 1937, a woman named Esther King, a descendant of Marsh Bend workers, told researchers, "My grandma say the tall ladies still walk in the fog. Say when the moon low and the tide high, you can see her shadow in the rice water. Don't mean no harm. Just looking." The interviewer asked what she was looking for, what all mothers look for. Esther said, "The thing they lost." Even the Crane family, long after Josiah's death, couldn't escape her shadow. His descendants fled Charleston, selling what remained of the estate. One great-grandson, writing in 1899, confessed that his family was haunted not by guilt, but by silence, the sense that the earth itself had judged us. That silence still hangs over the Low Country. If you walk the marshes at dusk, when the sky burns orange and the tide begins to rise, you'll hear the reeds hiss in the wind. Some say it's only the breeze. Others say it's the sound of a woman breathing slow, steady, eternal. And if you listen closely, you'll hear another sound. 2. A whisper beneath the hum of insects. The rustle of chains dragging softly through the mud. Perhaps it's imagination, or perhaps it's what remains when injustice is buried but never atoned for, the voice of the past refusing to be quiet. Because the story of Sarah Drummond isn't about monsters. It isn't even about vengeance. It's about the moment a human being, stripped of everything, decides she will never bow again. She was not a ghost. She was a mother. She was not a legend. She was proof. And her story endures because we need it to remind us that cruelty has consequences, that silence can break louder than screams, and that sometimes, when history tries to erase a person, the swamp remembers. 200 years later, the name Sarah Drummond still appears in whispers on museum placards and university papers, in songs sung quietly by descendants of those who once labored under the same sun. But ask any of the old families near Charleston, and they'll tell you the real record isn't in the archives. It's in the ground, in the trees that grew from the blood-soaked soil, in the water that still rises red some evenings when the tide runs high, and in the stillness of the marsh. If you stand long enough, you might hear her steady, patient, unbroken, calling a single name: Jacob.